She didn't scream when it happened. That was the part nobody understood afterward. When Seo Kang-min raised her hand across the dinner table and struck her daughter-in-law hard enough to split the room into before and after, Imani Rowe-Seo didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply fell. The sharp corner of the entryway cabinet caught the back of her skull, and the sound it made was wrong, too solid, too final, and the blood came fast and dark across white marble while the woman who had struck her stood above and said nothing. Not one word, not one step toward her. If you have ever loved someone whose family made you feel like an intruder in your own home, stay with me, because this story is going to go somewhere they never expected. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way through. You will not want to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Imani had a rule she kept for 5 years, a rule she never told anyone about, not even her closest friend Denise back in Atlanta, not even her own mother during their Sunday evening phone calls that always ran 40 minutes longer than planned. The rule was simple. She did not cry inside the Seo estate. Whatever happened at that dinner table, whatever was said in hallways, whatever cruelty arrived, wrapped in the polished language of a woman who had never once used a crude word in her life because she had found more precise instruments. Imani did not let a single tear fall within those walls. Those walls belonged to the Seo family. Her grief did not. She cried in the car. She cried in the parking structures of shopping centers. She had no intention of visiting. Hands gripped around the steering wheel of the Mercedes that bore Kang-min's name on the registration. She cried in the bathroom of her own organizing studio, the one she had not yet opened, the one that still smelled of fresh paint and possibility, sitting on the floor with her back against the door, while the jade plant she kept on the windowsill caught the afternoon light. But she did not cry inside those walls. She had told herself this was dignity. Now, sitting in a hospital bed with 3 stitches at the back of her skull and a bruise spreading from her left cheekbone toward her jaw like spilled ink, she was beginning to wonder if it had actually been something closer to denial. The attending nurse, a practical woman in her 40s named Carla, who had seen enough domestic situations to recognize them with a single glance, had asked twice if there was someone Imani wanted her to call. Imani had said no both times. Then she had stared at the ceiling of the private room for a long time, listening to the building's air circulation system hum, watching the fluorescent light above her flicker almost imperceptibly every 37 seconds. She counted. She needed something to count. Her husband was in Seoul, or had been in Seoul, or was somewhere between Seoul and wherever his plane had last touched down. Kang-min's movements were never entirely predictable, even when he told her his schedule, which lately he had been less careful about doing. The power struggle inside his organization had consumed him for the better part of 4 months-long calls behind closed doors, sudden departures at 3 a.m, security personnel cycling through the estate in new rotations she stopped trying to memorize. He had explained enough to explain nothing and apologized in the expensive, impersonal way of a man who believed a bracelet could translate for him. She had not thrown the bracelet away. That bothered her now. The stitches itched. She did not touch them. What she thought about, instead, in the strange, suspended quiet of that hospital room, was the jade plant. She had brought it with her when she moved into the Seo estate 5 years ago, a modest 3-year-old plant in a terracotta pot, a gift from her grandmother in Birmingham who said jade plants were survivors and that Imani needed something around her that understood what that meant. The plant had grown significantly under Imani's care-twisted, beautiful branches, dense with oval leaves, occupying a place of honor on the south-facing windowsill of the private sitting room that Hive had occasionally referenced as Imani's corner, with a tone that made the phrase sound like a polite word for something else. Over 5 years, Imani had repotted it twice. She had adjusted its light exposure through the seasons. She had researched soil composition and watering schedules, and the precise humidity conditions that jade plants preferred. In a house where almost nothing belonged to her in any meaningful sense, the furnitures selected by an interior designer whose aesthetic Imani had never been asked about, the staff oriented to Hiran's preferences regardless of what Imani requested, The weekly dinner arrangements structured around Korean traditions. She had tried genuinely to learn and been subtly corrected. For anyway, the jade plant was hers completely. She had grown it from what it was into what it became, and nobody could claim credit for that except her and the plant and her grandmother's original wisdom. She was not going to leave it in that house. The decision arrived with a clarity she hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. Imani pressed the call button for Nurse Carla. When she appeared, Imani asked for her discharge paperwork. Carla looked at the chart. Dr. Osi wanted to keep you overnight for observation. Given the head, I understand. I'd like to sign the AMA form if necessary. Imani's voice was level, not angry, just very, very decided. I need to be somewhere early tomorrow morning, and I need to rest before that. Carla studied her for a moment with the professional stillness of a woman who could read a room. Then she went to get the forms. The moving company Imani called operated out of a facility on the industrial edge of the city, and their dispatcher, a man named Roy, who answered on the second ring at 7:42 in the morning had initially hesitated when she gave the address. This Seo estate was not a name you attached to casually, even in a city where powerful names were common currency. But Imani had explained that she was the property owner's wife, that she had documentation supporting everything she intended to remove, and that she would require both movers and a supervising attorney present. Roy had paused for exactly 4 seconds. Then, we can be there by 9. Her attorney, Josephine Park, was a small, meticulous woman who had built her family law practice on the principle that preparation was more effective than drama. When Imani had first called her 18 months ago for what she'd described as preliminary consultation, Josephine had listened, said very little, and at the end of the meeting handed Imani a folder containing a detailed inventory framework. Just in case, she had said, without elaborating on the case. Imani had filled it in over the following year and a half, methodically, the way she did everything organized, documented, thorough. That folder was now in Josephine's leather briefcase, and Josephine's leather briefcase was in the front seat of the car that pulled through the Seo estate gates at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. Imani walked in through the front door like she owned the place, because in several meaningful legal respects, she did. The household staff, 12 people on a rotating schedule, none of whom had been hired by Imani or answered to her in any real sense, moved through their morning tasks with the careful avoidance of people who knew something significant was happening and had collectively decided the wisest position was neutrality. Imani did not ask any of them to help her. She did not address Hiran, who appeared at the top of the main staircase in a silk robe, with her hair already perfectly arranged, and stared down with an expression that mixed outrage with something Imani had learned to identify over 5 years as controlled calculation. What exactly do you think you're doing? Hiran's voice descended with practiced composure, the kind that treated every sentence as a minor ruling from a minor bench. Imani handed a copy of her documentation to Josephine and kept moving. Good morning, Hiran, that was all. Just the name. No title, no courtesy softening. The omission landed. Hiran descended 3 steps. Imani, I am speaking to you. I heard you. Imani walked into the sitting room and began carefully lifting the jade plant from the windowsill with both hands. She checked the soil, tilted the pot to examine the drainage hole, set it securely inside the padded crate the movers had brought specifically for it. You will put that down, Hiran said from the doorway. There was a new quality in her voice now. Something tighter, something that understood the pot and the crate and the attorney standing 20 feet away meant something it had not anticipated. That is a part of this household. It came in with me, Imani said. It leaves with me. Hiran turned toward Josephine. I want to know on what legal basis Mrs. Seo Rowe has full documentation of personal property and contributed assets. Josephine said pleasantly, I'd be happy to walk you through the inventory. We have time. She produced the folder. Hiran did not take it. Min-che materialized from somewhere. She had a talent for appearing at moments of family tension with impeccable timing, usually positioned slightly behind her mother, which gave her the ability to comment without ever being fully accountable. Uni is just emotional, she told no one in particular. She'll calm down and realize how this looks. Imani was lifting a framed photograph from the wall. Her and Kang-min at a beach somewhere in Portugal, 3 years ago, before the power struggles and the extended absences and the bracelets. She had liked that trip. She set the photograph in the box. "How it looks," she said, almost to herself. Min-chae folded her arms. "My brother will hear about this. I hope so," Imani said. That was the first moment Min-chae went quiet. It was the quietest the room had been all morning. The boxes accumulated in the foyer with a momentum that seemed to disturb Hairan on some visceral level beyond the practical. She made 2 phone calls to whom Imani did not know and did not care, and paced the length of the formal living room with the energy of a woman unaccustomed to situations she could not redirect through force of personality alone. Her cruelty had always been precise and administered. What Imani was doing was something different, patient, documented, and entirely outside the vocabulary Hairan had used to manage her for 5 years. The morning moved. Items left the house in an orderly sequence. Clothing. Specific furniture pieces Imani had purchased herself with money she could account for to the dollar. Financial documents from the private filing cabinet in the office she had used. The collection of art books she had assembled. The cooking equipment she had brought from her apartment before the marriage. Photographs. The small items that constitute a life lived somewhere. A specific candle, a particular throw blanket, the embroidered table runner her mother had sent 2 Christmases ago that Hairan had once described as charming, in a very particular way. Each item was noted in Josephine's inventory with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this before and understood that accuracy was its own form of power. Hairan said, "Around 11 in the morning, you are making a spectacle of yourself." Imani sealed a box. "I'm packing. You are embarrassing this family in front of staff. Your family embarrassed itself." Imani turned to look at her directly, which she had learned over 5 years not to do unless she meant it. Last night, in front of the same staff, a pause. And the cameras. Something crossed Hairan's face. Quick, almost invisible. Imani held eye contact for 2 more seconds, then went back to the box. She did not know, in that moment, how significant those 2 words would become. She only knew she had said them because they were true, and because she was done editing herself inside that house. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that in the international arrivals terminal at that moment, a black SUV was waiting, and the man stepping off a private flight 2 days ahead of schedule, still carrying the particular stillness of someone who had just concluded a violent and necessary piece of business overseas, was looking at his phone, reading a message from his security chief. The message contained 3 words and a file attachment. He opened the file. He watched 17 seconds of footage. Then he put the phone in his coat pocket and told his driver to go directly to the estate. Seo Kang-min was not a man who processed things outwardly. This had been one of Imani's earliest observations about him, back when observations about him had still felt like discovery rather than archaeology. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesticulate. He did not pace or pound tables or require the room to perform his emotions for him. What he did instead was become very, very still. The stillness was not peace. Anyone who had spent sufficient time near him understood that the stillness was actually the sound a room makes when everything in it is paying attention. His men understood this. His enemies understood this more clearly. His mother had perhaps convinced herself over the years that she was exempt from what the stillness meant. She was about to lose that exemption. The gates opened for the convoy at 11:47. 6 vehicles, dark and unhurried. The staff heard them before they saw them. The low sound of multiple engines running at the same steady pace, the kind of arrival that does not announce itself because it has never needed to. Hairan heard it too. She went to the window. Then she composed her expression with the speed of a woman who had spent 6 decades performing composure, and she moved toward the entry hall with the posture of someone about to deliver a prepared statement. Min-chae followed 2 steps behind, because that was her position and had always been her position. Kang-min came through the front door and stopped. He was not looking at his mother. He was looking at the boxes, at the movers moving with professional efficiency through his home, at the stripped walls, at the organized absence of the woman who had inhabited this house for 5 years, and was now, apparently, removing herself from it with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything she did. And then his eyes found the floor, near the entryway cabinet. The dark cabinet with the sharp corner. Someone had cleaned it, or tried to. There are stains that scrubbing makes lighter, but cannot erase completely, and the marble near the base of that cabinet held a shadow that had not been there when he left for Seoul. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the room went entirely silent. Hiran stepped forward. Kang-min, thank goodness. Your wife has... Where is she? The words came out at normal volume, which somehow made them louder than shouting would have. Hiran blinked. Kang-min, if you would let me explain. Where is my wife? It was not a question the second time. It was something else. Something that made the two movers near the staircase find reasons to look at the floor. Min-che said, she's outside by the... He was already moving. Imani had her back to the driveway when she heard his voice say her name. One word. Just her name. In the specific register he used when he was not performing anything for anyone. Not authority, not confidence, not the particular curated gravity of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Just her name, said the way he used to say it in the early years, when they were still figuring each other out and everything felt possible. She stopped. The back of her neck tightened. Not from fear or not entirely from fear. From the particular exhaustion of loving someone and being disappointed by them for long enough that even the sound of their voice carried the weight of everything that hadn't been said. She turned. He was standing 12 feet away, and she watched his face do something. She had seen it do perhaps 3 times in 5 years. It lost its management. The careful arrangement that told the world he was in control of every room he entered. It simply fell away when he saw her face. The bruise, the swelling along her jaw, the faint shadow of the stitches at the back of her head that she knew were visible even if she couldn't see them herself. He crossed the distance between them without looking at anything else. She stepped backward. 1 step, involuntary. He stopped. The space between them held everything 5 years of marriage, the distance he had traveled without bringing her, the walls he had never looked closely enough at, and that one small backward step that had told him more than any argument ever had. His wife was not afraid of him. She was afraid of his name, of the world attached to his name, of the house behind her that had used his authority as a weapon against her for 5 years while he was elsewhere doing other things. What happened to your face? His voice was quieter than she'd expected. She looked at him, straight at him, the way she had stopped doing somewhere around year 3, when looking at him directly had started to feel like an act that required more than she had. Ask your mother, she said. She watched it move through him, the whole sentence. 3 words and everything underneath them. Then she turned back to the moving truck and picked up the next box. The formal dining room of the Seo estate had hosted state-level business deals, family councils that had shaped significant decisions across 2 countries, and at least 3 events that Imani had organized entirely herself while being given approximately 0 credit for afterward. It was a room built for performance, and Kang-min had arranged it now for a different kind of performance than it was used to. Everyone was there. Hiran, Min-che, 3 aunts and an uncle who happened to be visiting, 2 family advisors, and Imani sitting at the far end of the table with her hands flat on the surface, and Josephine quietly positioned 2 chairs behind her because Imani had asked her to stay, and Josephine had looked at the room and said simply, "Of course." Kang-min sat at the head of the table. He did not speak for almost 90 seconds. He let the silence do what silence does in rooms full of people who have things to hide. Hiran filled it. She was practiced at filling silences before they became accusations. She described the previous evening in the vocabulary of accident and misunderstanding. Imani had been upset. Emotions had escalated. There had been a loss of balance, a terrible coincidence with the furniture. She had been about to call for assistance when the situation developed further. Kang-min made a phone call. 1 call. 40 seconds of conversation in Korean. His voice was the same as it always was. Completely controlled. His security chief arrived in 19 minutes. He carried a laptop. The footage ran for 11 minutes. Nobody spoke during it. Kang-min watched his mother say things he had never heard her say with such precision. About Imani's background. About her appearance. About whether a woman who looked and came from where Imani looked and came from could ever genuinely represent the Seo family. About the specific suggestion that his choice of wife had been either a weakness or a statement of indifference to the family name. The words were chosen with the care of a woman who understood that cruelty was most durable when it was not crude. She had never called Imani anything that could be pointed to easily. She had simply systematically, over years and years and condensed here into minutes, made the case that Imani did not belong. Then came the slap, Kang-min's jaw set, then the shove, and the fall, and the sound that Imani had described to no one and did not need to describe, because it was on camera. And then the footage kept running. His mother stood above her daughter-in-law on the marble floor and turned to staff and said she would handle this before Kang-min returned, that there was no need to involve him, that she would make sure everything was resolved appropriately. Not call an ambulance, not help her, not I need to reach my son. Make sure everything was resolved. Before he found out, Kang-min reached over and closed the laptop. The room had no sound in it. Hairan's eyes were wet. She began to speak, and her first 2 words were about sacrifice everything she had given, everything she had built, everything she had endured. You used my name, Kang-min said, to hurt my wife. I am your mother, and she is my wife. He said it like a correction. Final and calm and absolute. Hairan shifted. She was not a woman who moved from her positions easily, and she moved now to the position she had always known was available, the dignity of the Korean family, the bloodline, the particular cultural architecture of belonging that she had constructed around herself like a fortress. She spoke about what it meant to carry their name, what the family represented, what Imani could and could not be, regardless of the ring on her finger. Kang-min looked around the table, every face, slowly. He gave each person the experience of being seen by him, which, in a different context, not a comfortable experience. Anyone who believes that humiliating my wife protects my family, he said, can leave it with her. Nobody moved. For the first time in the memory of everyone present, Hairan had no backing, no quiet coalition, no subtle nods or strategic silences that amounted to permission. The room that had always subtly aligned with her simply didn't. She looked at her son, and he looked back, and neither of them was who they had been this morning. Imani, at the far end of the table, reached forward. She took off her wedding ring. It was a specific ring platinum, with a stone, that Kang-min had spent weeks and that Imani had loved deeply for the first 2 years of wearing it, and had looked at for the last 3, with an increasingly complicated feeling. She placed it on the table with a small sound, precise and deliberate and entirely without theater. Defending me now, she said, her voice steady, doesn't erase the 5 years when you didn't see what was happening. Kang-min looked at the ring, then at her, and Imani saw it, the exact moment when the most feared man in that room understood that the thing he had failed to protect was not his authority or his reputation or his organizational structure. It was his wife, in his own house over 5 years, while he was elsewhere managing every other piece of his world with extraordinary competence and treating the marriage as something that would maintain itself. He had built an empire. He had forgotten to build a home. The ring sat between them on the table, and neither of them touched it. The ring stayed on the table for 43 seconds. Imani counted. She couldn't help it. Counting was the thing her brain did when the alternative was falling apart in a room full of people who had already watched her bleed on their marble floor and done nothing. 43 seconds, and then Kang-min reached forward and picked it up, not to give it back to her, not to set it dismissively. He held it in his closed fist, the way a person holds something they cannot afford to lose and cannot figure out how to keep. And he stood from the table without looking at anyone, and he walked to the window that faced the east garden, and he stood there with his back to the room. Nobody spoke. This was the problem with powerful men, Imani had learned. The silence they generated when they were thinking was indistinguishable from the outside from the silence they generated when they had already decided. You couldn't tell which one you were living through until it was over. Hairan recovered first. She always recovered first. It was one of her genuine talents, the ability to locate her footing in shifting ground faster than anyone around her, to find the angle that returned her to a position of at least partial authority. She straightened in her chair. She folded her hands on the table with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of statement. And then she looked at Imani with the expression she had refined over 60-something years, not contempt exactly, because contempt was too honest, something more calibrated. Something that said, I see you attempting this, and I have seen attempted things before, and I am still here. You should understand, Hairan said. Her voice recovered to its usual measured register, that what you're doing right now has consequences that extend beyond this room. Imani looked at her. So did what you did last night. That was camera. Imani let the two words sit. We already covered this. Min-chae made a small sound that was trying to be a laugh and wasn't quite getting there. She's been waiting to do this, she said to no one in particular. This whole thing is choreographed. You can see it. Josephine, from her chair 2 positions behind Imani, opened her briefcase. The sound of the clasp was very quiet and very intentional. Min-chae's almost law stopped. One of the aunts, the one who sat closest to the window and had said nothing since the footage ended, pushed back her chair and stood. She was a small woman in her late 60s, Kang-min's father's sister, who had attended every family event for 20 years and whose opinions were usually expressed through strategic positioning rather than direct speech. Standing up in this context was itself a kind of speech. Hi Ran, she said carefully. Sit down, Auntie Young, Min-chae said. Auntie Young did not sit down. Hi Ran turned toward her with an expression that had been dissolving knees at family councils since before Min-chae was born. Auntie Young held eye contact for a breath, then 2. Then she said, I think perhaps we have all seen enough for today, and walked quietly toward the dining room door. It opened and closed with a soft click that sounded in that silence, like a starting pistol. The uncle followed, then one aunt, then the other. Not running, not making scenes. Just quietly removing themselves from a room that had become a different kind of room than the one they had sat down in, and not wanting to be counted among those who had stayed too long. Kang-min, at the window, did not turn around to watch them go. Hi-Ran stared at the door after it closed for the 4th time. The color in her face had shifted, not to the red of anger, but to the particular gray of a person who has just watched something she considered immovable move. So, she said finally, her voice finding a new edge. This is what 5 years of managing your wife's feelings has cost this family. Kang-min turned from the window. Everyone felt it. The turn, the way the room changed weight when he faced it again. Stop, he said, just that. Hi-Ran opened her mouth. I said stop. Still quiet, still entirely controlled. And somehow, because of that, worse than shouting would have been. I have listened to you speak for 20 minutes, and before that I watched 47 minutes of footage of how you speak when you believe nobody who matters is listening. He paused. I want you to understand something. That footage exists. It will continue to exist. And I have not yet decided what I do with it. The implications spread through the room like cold air through a cracked window. Hi-Ran's jaw set. You would not, I would not what? He looked at her steadily. You assumed things about what I would and wouldn't do for 5 years. How accurate were those assumptions? She had no answer for that. Min-chae stood up. It was an impulsive movement, the kind she'd been making since childhood, when the conversational terrain shifted under her and she needed to do something with the adrenaline. This isn't fair, she said, and she almost sounded young when she said it. Imani has been. She has never fit here, and we've all known it, and saying that out loud isn't the same as putting your hands on her, Kang-min said. Min-chae's mouth closed. Sit down, Min-chae. She sat, slowly, with the particular quality of someone sitting down because they cannot find the structural support to stay standing. Imani had been watching all of this from her end of the table, the way a person watches a controlled fire, with attention, with respect for what it could do, and with one eye always on the exits. She had learned to do this in the Seo estate, to be present and simultaneously positioned, to participate in rooms without giving them everything she had, because rooms like this had a way of taking what you gave and not returning it. But something was happening to her now that she hadn't anticipated, and it frightened her more than the argument, and more than Hi-Ran's face, and more than the 43 seconds with the ring on the table. She was tired. Not sleepy tired. Not the tired that lived in her stitches or the ache along her jaw. The other kind. The deep cellular exhaustion that accumulates from years of being almost okay. From 5 years of being the woman who could handle it, who adjusted, who found a way to make something workable out of situations that should never have been presented to her as acceptable in the first place. She was tired of the adjustment, of the translation, of the constant low-grade work of being a person in a space that had been designed, in every subtle and not so subtle way, to make her feel that being a person here was a privilege she needed to keep earning. She had been earning it for 5 years. She had a bruise on her face and stitches in her skull. She was done earning it. Kang-min asked everyone else to leave the room. He said it plainly, and people stood and went, because in the specific geometry of his authority, plainly was always sufficient. The family advisors left. The remaining staff who had been hovering near the corridor vanished. Min Che left last, and she looked at Imani on her way out with an expression that was complicated. Not quite an apology, not quite resentment. Somewhere in the territory where those two things border each other, and neither party is willing to step over the line. The door closed. Hai Ran remained seated. She was not a woman who was told to leave rooms in her son's house. She sat with this refusal arranged around her like the last remaining piece of furniture in an otherwise empty room. The thing you keep, because getting rid of it would mean admitting the room was finished. Kang-min let it go. For now. He walked to Imani's end of the table and stopped 3 chairs away. Not close, close enough. How is your head? He asked. 3 stitches. Minor concussion, they think. I left before they could be certain. Something moved in his face. You left the hospital without. I had things to do. He absorbed this. Imani. Don't, she held up one hand. Not dramatically, just firmly. The way you hold up a hand when you mean it. Don't say my name like that right now. Like it's something you're trying to hold on to. You've had 5 years to hold on to things, and you were mostly somewhere else. The sentence landed. Hai Ran, from the other end of the table, said, perhaps if you had been easier to... Mother? Kang-min did not raise his voice. He barely moved. One more word and you will leave this estate permanently tonight. Not the arrangement I had already decided on. Tonight, with what you can carry. Hai Ran went silent with the quality of a person who has just been handed something they weren't prepared to catch and is trying not to drop it. Imani looked at Kang-min. He was still 3 chairs away, and those 3 chairs felt like a measurement of something. When did you get back? This morning. Your business finished early. Yes. When did your security chief send you the footage? A pause. 1 beat. On the way from the airport. So you knew when you walked through the door? Yes. Imani nodded, slowly processing. And you came inside anyway, without calling me first. Without she stopped. Restarted. I had already left the hospital and come back and started moving before you got here. You knew what had happened and you still didn't call me. He opened his mouth. She kept going. Not angry, and that was worse somehow than angry would have been. Just precise. I'm not saying you didn't come. I'm saying that was the moment. When you were in that car with that footage on your phone. That was the moment when the first thing you did could have been to call your wife, who had spent the night in the hospital alone and had discharged herself alone and was removing herself from your house alone. And the first thing you did was come to the house. The quiet stretched. I came for you, he said. You came here, she said. I wasn't here. I was outside by the truck. It was a specific distinction. He understood it was specific because everything Imani said was specific. She was the most precise person he had ever known, which was part of why he had loved her, and apparently also part of why the last 5 years had been building to this room. Hai Ran left the table 20 minutes later, not because she was told again, because she had run out of strategic positions and the room had become something she no longer recognized as territory she could manage. She walked past Imani without speaking, which was its own specific kind of statement, and the hem of her robe made a sound on the tile that was very quiet and very final. The dining room door closed behind her. In the silence that followed, Imani and Kang-min sat you sit with other in the way that people sit with things they cannot solve in a single conversation and cannot leave unsaid either. What do you want? Kang-min asked. Not the legal version of the question, the actual one. Imani thought about the jade plant, currently in its padded crate in the back of the moving truck. She thought about the studio across the city, still smelling of paint, with the south-facing window that would be perfect. She thought about her grandmother in Birmingham, who had given her a plant and a principle, and she thought about 5 years of learning that principles need tending the same way plants do, or they start to curl at the edges. I want to finish moving, she said. He looked at the ring in his fist. He hadn't opened his hand since he'd picked it up. And then? He asked. And then I'm going to figure out what comes after then, she said, without asking anyone's permission. He nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing a blow they had agreed to take. He stopped. Kang-min? Her voice was not unkind. That was the thing he would think about afterward, that she had looked at him clearly and spoken to him without cruelty, even when cruelty would have been entirely justified. There isn't a sentence that starts right now and ends with what you want it to end with. There's only what happens next, and what happens next is I leave, and you deal with your house. And somewhere much further down the line, we figure out if there's anything left that's worth figuring out. He unclenched his fist. The ring sat in his open palm. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that belongs to the moment, and not to you. Imani looked at it. She did not pick it up. She pushed her chair back and stood. The motion was slightly careful. Her head still ached at the back, a deep specific ache that she suspected would be with her for several days. But she stood straight, and she picked up the water glass she'd been given at the start of this conversation, and she carried it to sideboard and set it down, because she was not the kind of person who left a glass sitting on an antique table, and that had not changed and would not change. "I'm going back to the truck," she said. "The movers have been waiting." She walked past 3 chairs, past the place where Hai-Ran had sat, past the space at the head of the table that Kang-min had occupied, and that still held the shape of his presence, even now that he was standing. She paused at the door. Not to give him something. She wasn't going to give him a meaningful look or a line he could hold on to. She paused because the door handle was slightly sticky and needed to be turned with deliberate pressure, which she had known for 5 years, and had mentioned twice, and had eventually simply accepted. She turned it. The door opened. She left. The grand hall of the Seo estate was a room that had been designed to communicate consequence. High ceilings, stone floors. The kind of space that made everything conducted within it feel historical, which was partly the point. Kang-min had assembled everyone in it an hour after Imani left the dining room household staff, family advisors, 3 senior members of his organization who had driven to the estate within 40 minutes of receiving a text message containing only a meeting time and a location, because that was the kind of text message you responded to. Hai-Ran was there. She had changed from her robe into a proper dress, and she had done her hair, because in a crisis, Rowe-Seo dressed for it. She stood slightly apart from the staff, close enough to the advisors to suggest alliance, and she watched her son take his position at the front of the room, with the expression of a woman who had watched him do this for 35 years, and was calculating how much of this was performance and how much was declaration. She miscalculated. Every vehicle registered to this household, Kang-min said, that is currently used by Hai-Ran or Min-shae is to be removed from their access as of this evening. The accounts they draw from for personal expenses are frozen pending my further instruction. Their access codes for every property I own in this city, including this estate, are to be deactivated within the hour. He paused. Every staff member who reports to them directly is reassigned. No exceptions. The advisor nearest to Hai-Ran, a man in his 60s named Byung-ho, who had been with the family for 20 years, and who Hai-Ran had always treated as something between an employee and an ally, turned and looked at her. Just looked at her. Then turned back. Min-shae, standing to Hai-Ran's left, made a small sound that might have been protest, and might have been the air leaving something. Hai-Ran's voice came out exactly as controlled as she could make it, which was not entirely controlled. "You're doing this publicly. You're doing it in front of staff." "Yes," Kang-min said. "To humiliate me." "No." He looked at her steadily. "Because you did it publicly. Because you made choices in front of staff and cameras and a dining room full of family about what kind of person my wife was and what she deserved. So this is public too. The same audience for both." Hai-Ran's jaw moved. "What you did," Kang-min said, and his voice found a lower register that everyone in the room stood a little straighter in response to without quite knowing they were doing it. "You did because you believed my name and my power would protect you from consequence, that I would find out and that I would manage it. Quietly. The way things get managed." He paused. "My wife was on the floor of this house, bleeding because of decisions you made. And your first decision after that was not to get her help. It was to get ahead of me finding out." Hai-Ran opened her mouth. "I watched it," he said. "All of it." Her mouth closed. "My wife," he said to the room, slowly and with a clarity that left no space for interpretation, "was never beneath this family." He let this settle. Then his eyes moved to Hai-Ran. She's just the person holding it together. Rowe-Seo, who had managed a powerful family through the death of a husband, through organizational crises, through decades of the particular pressures that came with the life they lived, looked around the room for support, the way a person looks for a foothold when the ground has shifted. The staff kept their eyes down. The advisors kept their faces neutral. The three organizational men kept their faces the way they always kept theirs, which was a discipline that extended to every room they entered. Nobody offered her anything. Something in her face moved. Not a crumbling, she was not a woman who crumbled. And even now she did not crumble, but a rearrangement. A restructuring of features around a new reality. And in the space created by that rearrangement, something that had been managed for a long time came forward. She took him from me, Hiran said, quietly. Not to the room. Almost to herself. Kang-min heard it. No one took me from you, he said. I have been standing in this family my entire life. If the distance between us is new, look at what created it. A pause. Look at the footage. Hiran raised her chin, and then she raised her hand. She raised it toward Imani, who had come through the hall doors 40 seconds ago and was standing 12 feet away with the jade plant's crate under her arm, and Josephine behind her, having returned to collect 2 boxes the movers had missed, and who had stopped in the doorway when she saw the assembly and then simply stood there because there was no clean exit and she was not going to run. Hiran's hand was rising, and the room understood what it was doing before it finished doing it, and at least 3 people drew breath. Kang-min moved. He was across the distance in 4 steps, and he caught his mother's wrist. Gently, firmly, both of those things at once, which is its own kind of statement. He held it. He did not squeeze. He simply held it, and he lowered it, and he stood between his mother and his wife, and he looked at Hiran until she looked away. Never again, he said. That's the last time that hand goes up in her direction. In any direction. Do you understand me? It was not a question. Hiran looked at her son's face, really looked at it, and something passed across her expression that Imani had never seen there before. Not apology? Not exactly. Something older and less comfortable. Something that recognized, perhaps, for the first time in the long years of managing him, her son had become someone she had not entirely accounted for. That the power she had spent his entire life proximate to had become something that no longer bent in her direction. She looked past him at Imani. Imani met her eyes. I didn't take your son, Imani said. Her voice was steady and low, and she wasn't performing anything. Not triumph, not vindication. She was tired, and her head hurt, and she was holding a plant in a crate, and she just said the true thing. Your hatred pushed him away. Hiran made a sound. Low, controlled, dangerous. And then her hand moved again, the same hand, the same arc, the muscle memory of a woman who had spent a lifetime having the last word in physical spaces. Kang-min caught her wrist again, the same grip, the same firmness. But this time he held it a beat longer. That's enough, he said. The room held itself absolutely still. Hiran's arm went down. She looked at her son for a long moment. And then, with the precision of a woman who had never let anyone see her truly lose, she turned and walked toward the hall's side door at a pace that was perfectly measured, not fleeing, not shuffling, moving on her own terms to the door she chose. Min-chae scrambled to follow her, and the 2 of them disappeared through it, and the door closed, and the room let out a breath it had been holding in collective. Imani stood with the jade plant's crate and watched the door for a moment after it closed. Then she turned and looked at Kang-min. He was still standing where he'd been when he'd caught his mother's wrist, in the center of the hall, with his organizational men behind him and his staff in front of him, and none of the people in this room being the person he needed to say something to. He looked at Imani. She looked at him. And then she shifted the crate under her other arm and walked toward the exit, and Josephine fell in behind her, and the front doors of the Seo estate opened for what would turn out to be the last time that Imani Rowe-Seo would walk through them as a resident. The moving truck was still running outside. The jade plant was secure in its crate, and on the marble floor of the entry hall, in the spot where the cleaning hadn't quite worked, the faint shadow of what had happened there was still visible under the afternoon light. A reminder that some things, once they've happened, cannot be managed back into the floor. They simply become part of the house, and you learn to live in a house that holds that, or you leave. Imani had made her choice. The truck doors closed. And when Kang-min came through the front entrance a minute later and stood on the estate steps watching the convoy of moving vehicles roll toward his gates, He did something nobody in his organization had ever seen him do in a professional context, and very few people had seen him do in any context. He did nothing. He simply stood there. No phone call. No order given. No gesture that closed the gates or redirected the trucks or exercised the considerable power available to a man of his particular position and particular temperament. He stood on the steps of a house that was, for the first time in 5 years, about to be completely his, and he watched her leave it. The gates opened automatically on the truck's approach, the way they always did when the sensor registered an authorized vehicle, and the mechanical sound of them parting was the specific sound of something that could not be undone, and Kang-min stood on his steps and listened to it, and did not move until the last vehicle had cleared the property line, and the gates had begun their slow automated return to closed. He was still holding the ring. He had been holding it since the dining room. He opened his hand and looked at it, this specific object he had spent weeks selecting, and that she had worn for 5 years, and that now sat in his palm like a question he didn't know how to answer, and then he closed his hand again. Because the gates had just finished closing, and the driveway was empty, and for the first time in the 23 years he had run this estate, in one capacity or another, Seo Kang-min was entirely, absolutely alone inside it. The studio smelled like paint and possibility, and underneath both of those things, the particular smell of a woman who had been awake for 31 consecutive hours and was running on the specific fuel of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to conserve. Imani set the jade plant on the south-facing windowsill at 4:17 in the afternoon. She stepped back, looked at it. The afternoon light came through the glass at exactly the angle she had imagined. When she signed the lease on this space 8 months ago, a lease she had paid for with her own money, from her own account, the one she had opened 2 years into the marriage at a bank, that had no relationship with any Seo affiliated institution. She had not been planning to leave when she opened that account. She had told herself she was being practical. Looking back now, she understood that she had been listening to something in herself that knew before the rest of her was willing to. The jade plant's leaves caught the light and held it. Josephine had left an hour ago, after walking Imani through the immediate next steps with the calm efficiency that had made her worth every dollar of her considerable retainer. Temporary residence documentation, financial separation filings, the inventory, already completed and submitted, of everything removed from the estate. "You're in a strong position," Joseph said at the door. Not warmly. Josephine was not a warm woman, but with the specific satisfaction of a professional who had prepared carefully and watched the preparation hold. "Let me know when you're ready for the next conversation." Imani had nodded. She had closed the door. She had sat on the floor of her empty studio for approximately 11 minutes, back against the wall, knees up, hands in her lap, looking at the jade plant on the windowsill. Not crying, not yet ready to cry. In the strange suspended territory between the end of something and whatever came after it, where you are too exhausted to feel the full weight of what has just happened and too awake to sleep through it. Her phone was on the floor beside her. It had been vibrating periodically, and she left since the estate messages she was not reading, numbers she was not answering. Kang-min had called twice. She had watched the screen light up and go dark, and light up again, and go dark again. She had not moved. Her friend Denise in Atlanta had called once and sent a text that read simply, "I'm here, whenever." No pressure, that text she had read. She had not responded to it yet, because responding to it would require deciding how to begin, and beginning meant choosing a version of events to lead with, and every version she considered felt simultaneously true and insufficient. What had happened to her was not a thing that summarized cleanly. It was 5 years of accumulation, detonating in a single evening, and the debris field was larger than any single sentence could account for. She picked up the phone. She called Denise. It rang once. "I'm here," Denise said. Imani opened her mouth, and for a moment, nothing came out, not because she was crying, but because the architecture of the past 31 hours was simply very large, and her throat had encountered it and wasn't sure how to route around it. And then she said, "She hit me, D." Silence on the line. Then, "Tell me." So Imani told her. All of it in the flat, direct way of a person reporting facts, because facts are load-bearing, and if you let yourself stray into the emotional register, everything will come down at once. She told her about the dinner, and the slap, and the fall, and the marble floor, and the blood, and the ambulance she had called herself, and the hospital room, and the 9:14 arrival at the estate, and the boxes, and Josephine, and the ring, and the dining room, and Hiran's hand going up the second time, and Kang-min's hand catching it, and the moving truck, and the gates, and the studio, and the jade plant on the south-facing windowsill. She told her all of it. When she finished, there was a brief silence on the line, the kind of silence that is not absence, but presence, the sound of someone on the other end holding what you just gave them with appropriate weight. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Denise asked. "There's a hotel 3 blocks from the studio. I have a reservation." Okay, a pause. "You need anything?" "Not tonight." Imani looked at the jade plant. "Tonight I need to be in a room by myself and not have to perform anything for anyone." "Then do that," Denise said. "Call me tomorrow, I will." And Imani, "Yeah. You did the right thing. Not effusive, not dramatic. Just stated the way Denise stated things as fact, not comfort. Whatever happens from here. You did the right thing today." Imani held the phone against her ear for a moment after the call ended, the same way you hold a warm cup after the coffee is gone. Not because there's anything left in it, but because letting go of it means accepting that it's over. Then she set the phone down, got up off the floor, and went to water the jade plant. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, several things happened that Imani did not know about. Kang-min dismissed 4 household staff members who had been employed directly by Hiran and whose primary function, his security chief confirmed upon review, had been as much informational as domestic people who reported back to Hiran on Imani's movements, her calls, her visitors, and her activity in the estate's less trafficked rooms. He made this discovery at 11 o'clock on the evening of the first day, sitting alone in the estate's study, with the security logs spread across the desk, and he sat very still with this information for a long time, before he picked up his phone and called his chief and said, with a quiet that had a specific temperature to it, "How long?" The answer was approximately 4 years. He sat with that number. 4 years of his household running a surveillance structure around his wife that he had not authorized and had not known about. 4 years of Hiran having, at any given time, a current and detailed picture of what Imani was doing, who she was talking to, and which parts of the estate she was using for which purposes. All, while Kang-min was elsewhere managing crises that, in retrospect, had a way of escalating at moments that now felt less coincidental. He called Josephine Park at 7:30 the following morning. She answered on the 3rd ring and said nothing, just waited. "This is Kang-min Seo," he said as though she might not know. "I need you to tell Imani something. I'm Imani's attorney, Mr. Seo. I'm not a messenger service." A pause. "Tell her there is information she needs to have before she makes any permanent legal decisions. Tell her it changes things." Another pause. Longer. "She'll decide whether she wants to hear it," Josephine said. "That's all I'm asking." Josephine said she would pass it along. She did not promise anything beyond that. She ended the call before he could add anything, which was its own kind of professional statement. Imani was at the hotel on the 2nd morning when she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. Not Kang-min's number, not any number in her contacts. She let it go to voicemail. The message was 38 seconds long, and it was left by a woman who identified herself as Park Soo-yeon and who said that she was calling because she had information about Imani's situation that she believed Imani deserved to have, and that she was sorry for calling this way, and that she understood if Imani chose not to respond. Imani played the message twice. Then she sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at the carpet and thought about the specific texture of a situation that was already complicated becoming more so. About the way new information had a way of arriving, precisely when you had achieved enough clarity to act on what you already knew, and how new information could cloud that clarity in ways that served almost nobody, except the people who had withheld it. She called the number back. Park Soo-yeon answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting. She spoke quickly, with the slight over-precision of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, but was losing the rehearsal to nervousness. She said she was 28 years old. She said she had been employed by the Seo family's primary shipping company for 3 years, in a mid-level administrative role. She said she had considered calling for several months, and had not called because she was afraid of what it might cost her. And she had made the call this morning because she had seen something on a private family communication channel she had access to through her work, and what she had seen had made her feel that not calling would cost her something more than calling would. "What did you see?" Imani asked. Soo-yeon took a breath. "There was a discussion," she said, in the family advisory channel, about the footage from the estate. A pause. "The footage from that night. What about it?" Madam Hiran's personal attorney contacted 3 members of the family board 2 days ago. "There is a claim being prepared." Another pause, shorter. "A claim that the footage was edited, that what is shown is not the complete sequence of events." Imani was quiet for a moment. "That's not true," she said. "I know." Soo-yeon's voice was careful and steady. "I know because I have seen the original timestamp data from the estate's security system. I have access to those logs through my administrative role. The footage is continuous and unedited, but the claim is being prepared regardless, and if it is filed, it creates a legal cloud over everything. The documentation of what happened to you, the evidentiary weight of the recording, your position in any proceedings." A pause, and there is something else. Imani waited. "The claim," Soo-yeon said, "is not just about the footage. The quality of the silence on the line changed. The filing also includes a counter-allegation." Soo-yeon's voice dropped slightly, not from drama, but from the particular register of someone saying something they do not want to have to say. "It alleges that you had a financial arrangement with a former associate of the Seo organization. That money moved between your personal account and this associate over a period of 18 months. The filing presents this as evidence of," she stopped, started again, "of deliberate infiltration, of a coordinated effort to position yourself within the family for financial extraction." The hotel room went very quiet. Imani's hand tightened on the phone. "What account?" she said, not a question. "A demand. The account at Meridian Federal. Opened. Approximately 2 years into your marriage." The account. The one she had opened herself. The one at the bank with no Seo affiliations. The one she had told herself was practicality. "What associate?" she said. "A man named Daniel Cho. He was removed from Kang-min's organization approximately 14 months ago under circumstances that are..." A careful pause. Unclear. Internally, Imani had never heard that name in her life. She said this. "I understand," Soo-yeon said, "but the documentation being prepared shows 6 transactions over 18 months between your account and an account held by a shell company that traces back to Cho." "That's not possible," Imani said. "I know every transaction in that account. Do you have documentation of them?" Of course, she stopped. Did she have documentation of every transaction? She had her own records, her own memory of deposits and withdrawals and transfers. But she had not audited the account recently. She had not had reason to audit the account recently because it was her account and she knew what was in it. And the entire point of the account was that it was clean, that it was hers, that it was the one financial instrument in her life that had absolutely nothing to do with the Seo family or anyone connected to them. "I need to see what they have," she said. "I can send you what I have access to," Soo-yeon said, "which is the internal memo and the preliminary filing draft. It is not the complete documentation, but it is enough for you to understand what is coming. Send it. I need to know you understand the risk I'm taking doing this." "I understand." Imani's voice was flat and clear. "Send it." The files arrived 12 minutes later. Josephine Park's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled of recycled air and expensive coffee, and Josephine was already at her desk when Imani arrived at 11:40, 47 minutes after she had called and said, "Clear your morning." Josephine had cleared her morning. She read the files Imani sent her with the focused stillness of a woman, reading something she needed to read completely before she allowed herself to react to it. Imani sat across from her and watched her read and did not speak, because speaking would not have helped anything, and she had learned over the years that Josephine's silences were working silences. They produced something. When Josephine finished, she set down the papers. 6 transactions, she said. "That I did not make," Imani said. "I understand. Walk me through your account access." They went through it. Every transaction Imani could account for in the 18-month revenue, the deposits from her organizing studio revenue, the withdrawals for rent and studio equipment, and the specific operational costs of building a small business, the quarterly transfers to her personal savings, The 2 wire transfers to her mother's account for her mother's roof repair and the birthday gift Imani had given her parents last year. Everything she could name, she named, with the specificity of a woman who had spent her professional life organizing other people's information and applied that same methodology to her own. None of it matched 6 transactions, totaling $63,000 sent over 18 months to an account she had never heard of connected to a man whose name she had heard for the first time 47 minutes ago. They got into the account, Josephine said, or fabricated the documentation. Either way, Josephine's voice was steady. This is not a minor allegation. If this filing moves forward with anything resembling credible documentation, it reframes the entire narrative. You go from a victim of abuse to a suspected operative. Every piece of evidence that works in your favor, the footage, the medical records, the witness accounts of what happened at that estate, all of it, gets contaminated by the allegation. Defense attorneys call it poisoning the well. A pause. It's effective. It's a lie, Imani said. Of course it is. And we may be able to prove that. But proving a negative takes time. And in that time, Josephine paused. There are consequences. What kind of consequences? Josephine folded her hands on the desk. The Seo family has significant influence over certain institutional relationships in this city. Not illegal influence, necessarily. The kind that accumulates naturally around significant money over a long period of time. The kind that affects, in ways that are difficult to trace or legally challenge, how certain processes move. She paused. The lease on your studio. Imani went still. Your landlord has a financing relationship with a real estate holding company that is not directly connected to the Seo family, Josephine said, but connects through 2 intermediary companies to a family advisory fund. Another pause. I noticed this when I reviewed your lease documents 8 months ago. I didn't mention it because at the time it appeared irrelevant. And now, Imani said, now it may be relevant. The room held this. Imani had been breathing at a steady rate through this entire conversation, with the specific discipline of a woman who had decided before she walked in that she was going to stay functional regardless of what the room threw at her. She was breathing at that rate now. She could feel the effort of it, the slight mechanical quality of maintained composure when your body wants to do something else. They can reach the lease, she said. They may already have. How quickly? A standard commercial lease has termination provisions for cause. If the landlord is motivated to find cause, Josephine left it there. And the account. We need to move the account's funds immediately. Today, before any freeze can be obtained through legal action. I can direct you on that within the next hour. Josephine picked up a pen. There are also your personal assets at the estate that have not yet been physically transferred to your possession. The settlement documentation covers them legally, but legal coverage and physical possession are 2 different things, and in a situation where the other side is prepared to litigate aggressively. They're trying to trap me, Imani said. It came out quiet, not as an outburst. Just as recognition, the specific flat sound of a person identifying the shape of something they should, perhaps, have anticipated sooner. The allegation about the account, Imani said. Even if we disprove it, even if we prove the transactions were fabricated or the account was accessed without my authorization, the process itself, the time it takes, the cost, the narrative it creates, keeps you unstable, Josephine said, keeps you financially stressed, keeps you legally occupied in a way that prevents you from moving forward. And if it reaches media, which these things sometimes do, when a family has the right relationships, it becomes the story, Imani said, instead of what actually happened to you. The room was quiet. Imani looked at the window behind Josephine. 14th floor facing west, afternoon light starting to shift. Outside, the city moved with complete indifference to the specific crisis being assembled inside this office, which was not a comfort, but was at least a reminder that the world was larger than the thing happening in it. Who is Daniel Cho? She said. Josephine had already pulled something up on her screen. 41 years old, removed from Kang-min's organization 14 months ago. The public record on the circumstances of his removal is minimal. A pause. He has since filed 2 civil claims against the Seo organization. Both were settled privately. Hiran found him, Imani said. That would be my working assumption. She found someone with an existing grievance against the organization and used him to build a fabricated financial connection to me. Imani said it the way you say something you're hearing yourself say for the first time, testing the weight of it. She planned this. She planned a version of it, Josephine said carefully. Whether she anticipated the footage, whether she anticipated the speed of events, she planned a contingency, Imani said. If things went wrong, if I ever tried to leave or tried to fight back. A pause. This is what was waiting. Josephine did not contradict this. How long do I have, Imani asked, before the filing moves forward? If they file today, which is unlikely, they'll want to ensure the documentation is complete. Then we have somewhere between 72 hours and 2 weeks before we need to respond formally. If they're building this carefully, which this appears to be, closer to 2 weeks. And Kang-min, Imani said, he called you. Josephine's expression did not change. He did. He said there was information I needed to have before I made permanent decisions. Imani looked at her attorney carefully. Is this what he meant? I don't know what he meant, Josephine said. I haven't spoken to him since that call. But he knew something was coming. With someone who would be consistent, discovered the staff's surveillance, and then started looking at what else had been operating in his house without his knowledge. Imani pressed her fingertips flat against the desk, not in anger, just in the need to have something solid under her hands. He knew his mother was preparing something, and he called you instead of calling me. He called me because he knew you wouldn't take his call. He was right, Imani said, but he still chose the easier path. Josephine waited. I need to know everything, Imani said. Every angle they have, every connection between Cho and that account, and whatever documentation they've manufactured. I need to understand the full shape of what this is before I decide how to respond to it. That's what I'm here for. And she stopped, looked at her hands on the desk, looked at the window, looked back at Josephine. I need to know if fighting this, the way they want me to fight it, is actually the right move. Because they built this to be fought in a specific way. They built it to pull me into a legal process that exhausts me and costs me, keeps me reactive. And I don't want to be reactive anymore. Josephine tilted her head slightly. What's the alternative? I don't know yet, Imani said. But I need you to think about it with me. Josephine looked at her client across the desk, the woman who had walked out of a hospital alone, who had packed her own life into boxes with an attorney present, who had stood in a room full of powerful people and said the true thing in a flat and unperformative voice, and who was now sitting across from her with stitches at the back of her skull and a bruise fading from yellow at its edges, asking how to fight a war on terms she chose rather than terms chosen for her. Josephine uncapped her pen. Then let's think, she said. At the Seo estate, in the study where Kang-min had spent the previous 2 nights going through security logs and financial records, and the organizational archaeology of his own household, his chief of security set a folder on the desk at 7 in the evening and said, "There's more." Kang-min looked at the folder. "The account activity we found attached to Cho," the chief said. "We ran the transaction origin points." A pause. 2 of the 6 transactions originate from an IP address registered to a device on this property's network. Kang-min opened the folder. He looked at the transaction logs, at the IP data, at the device identifier. Then he looked up. "This device," he said. "Where is it?" "It was logged out of the network 3 days ago, the day before Mrs. Seo Rowe returned to the estate to move her belongings." A pause. "It had been on the network for 14 months. 14 months. The same window as the transactions. Registered to whom?" Kang-min said, though something in the set of his face suggested he had already begun to know. His chief set a single additional page on the desk. Kang-min, read it. He set it down. He sat in a particular quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man who has just had the floor reveal itself to be several feet lower than he was standing, and who is in the process of understanding that the drop was not an accident, and was not recent, and was not something that happened to him. It was something that had been prepared, around him, in his own house, for a very long time. He picked up his phone and he called a number, and when the person on the other end answered, he said, with the quietness that had arrived somewhere on the other side of anger and had no temperature left in it at all, "I need you to find Daniel Cho. Tonight. Bring him to me." A pause. "And call Josephine Park's office. Tell them Seo Kang-min needs a meeting." Another pause. The last one. tell them it's about his wife. Daniel Cho was not a difficult man to find. That was the first thing Kang-min's security chief reported at 9:47 in the evening, with a tone that communicated this was not a coincidence. A man who does not want to be found is himself difficult to find. Daniel Cho had been living in a serviced apartment 12 minutes from the SEO estate for the past 6 weeks under his own name, with a lease paid quarterly in advance, and a lifestyle that cost more than his publicly declared income could account for. He had not been hiding, he had been waiting, which meant he knew something was going to happen and had positioned himself to be available when it did. Kang-min read the address. "Bring him," he said carefully. His chief understood what carefully meant in this context. It meant no marks. It meant Cho arriving under his own power, walking through a door, sitting in a chair, as a man who still had options, rather than a man who had been made to understand he did not. Because a man who believed he still had options would talk. A man who believed otherwise would calculate, and calculating men said only what they had decided in advance to say, which was rarely the thing you actually needed to hear. The apartment building's lobby camera captured Cho leaving at 10:19. He was wearing a jacket despite the warmth of the evening, which his chief noted, and which meant the jacket was covering something. And so the two men who accompanied Cho into the vehicle were prepared for that, and the something under the jacket was removed before the door closed. And Cho sat between them in the back seat and looked straight ahead with the expression of a man running numbers. Kang-min was waiting in a room at the back of one of his legitimate properties, a private club on the eastern edge of the financial district, closed on weeknights, where the sound insulation was thorough, and the staff understood that certain rooms on certain evenings were not rooms they had seen in use. He was sitting at a small table when Cho was brought in. No theater, no staged lighting, just a table and 2 chairs and a glass of water on each side, because Kang-min had learned a long time ago that the absence of theater communicated more than theater did. Cho sat down. He was 41 and looked like someone who had spent the last 14 months in the specific physical condition of sustained low-level stress. Not broken, not desperate, but worn at the edges in the way that prolonged vigilance wears a person. He looked at Kang-min with eyes that were doing calculation and trying not to show that they were doing calculation. "I want a lawyer," he said. "This isn't that kind of meeting," Kang-min said. "Then what kind is it?" "The kind where you tell me who paid you." Cho looked at the glass of water, looked at the door, looked back at Kang-min. "I don't know what you're." "The account," Kang-min said. "The 6 transactions. My wife's name attached to your shell company over 18 months. A pause. The device on my estate's network that was used to originate 2 of those transactions. Another pause. Shorter. The device registered to a woman named Park Ji-won, who was employed as a household coordinator at my estate for 14 months and who left my employ 3 days ago." Cho's face did something small and involuntary around the eyes. "Park Ji-won reported to my mother," Kang-min said. "You knew Park Ji-won." It was not a question. Cho picked up the glass of water, set it down without drinking. The calculation behind his eyes had reached a result, and he was deciding whether to share it. "I have documentation," Cho said carefully, "of everything, held in 3 separate locations. If anything happens to me." "I'm not going to do anything to you," Kang-min said. There was no reassurance in it, just information, delivered flatly. "What I'm going to do is listen to what you say in the next 20 minutes, and then I'm going to make a decision about what your cooperation is worth to me. And then you're going to leave this room and go back to your apartment. And in approximately 4 days your lease, there's going to become considerably more expensive." A pause. "Those are the terms. You can take them, or you cannot take them." Cho looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "She approached me 11 months ago. Imani was awake at 2 in the morning in her hotel room, sitting at the small desk near the window, with her laptop open, and her financial records spread across the screen in a sequence she had gone through 4 times already. Each time, the same result, she could account for every transaction she had made from that account. Everyone. The account was clean and had always been clean, and the 6 transactions Soo-yeon had described were not in her records because she had not made them, which meant they were in someone else's records, which meant someone had constructed them. She was working backward through the account's access history, the login timestamps, the device identifiers, the IP addresses, using the bank's online security portal which showed the last 12 months of access events. She was looking for the intrusion point, the place where someone else had been in her account, while she believed she was the only one who had ever been in it. She found it at 2:17 in the morning, 11 months ago. A login from a device she did not recognize, at an IP address she did not recognize, at 4:30 in the morning, lasting 9 minutes. The login had accessed her transaction history and her account routing information and then logged out. It had not initiated any transactions. It had only looked. Because you don't need to make real transactions when you're building a fabricated record. You only need to know enough about the account structure to make the fabricated record look real. She stared at the timestamp. 11 months ago, while she was in the estate, while her husband was somewhere, she checked her own calendar notes from that period in Tokyo for 10 days, for what he had described as a routine organizational meeting that had run long, while she was alone in the house with Hiran's staff. She saved the screen, took a screenshot, sent it to Josephine with a message that said, "Found the intrusion point. Call me when you're up." Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room for a while and thought about the specific shape of what she was looking at. 11 months of preparation. A fabricated financial connection to a man with an existing grievance against Kang-min's organization. A device planted on the estate's network by someone on the household staff. A counter-allegation ready to be filed precisely at the moment Imani tried to leave or tried to fight back. The whole apparatus, sitting behind the walls of her marriage, assembled with patience, waiting for the moment it would be needed. This was not a slap at a dinner table. That had been impulsive Hiran losing the careful management she usually applied. This was something built over nearly a year by a woman who had never intended to lose the dinner table confrontation, but had prepared for the possibility anyway. This was not cruelty. This was strategy, and Imani had been living inside it without knowing. She thought about Kang-min catching his mother's wrist, standing between them in the grand hall with his face set and his voice at that specific temperature. She thought about the call he had made to Josephine, the information he said she needed. She thought about the 4 years of staff surveillance she didn't know about yet, but would learn about later. She thought about a man who had built an empire and had not looked closely enough at his own house and was now apparently looking very closely indeed. She thought about whether it mattered. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought about her jade plant on the south-facing windowsill of the studio and about her grandmother's voice on the phone last Sunday saying, "Baby, a plant that survives a hard winter grows back stronger because it had to, not because it wanted to, because it didn't have a choice." She picked up her phone. She looked at Kang-min's number for 40 seconds. Then she put the phone down, face up, on the desk beside the laptop, and she went back to the financial records. Josephine called at 7:12 the next morning. "I have information from 2 directions," she said, without preamble. "Which do you want first?" "The worst one," Imani said. "The filing has been dated. Hiran's attorney registered it with the court system yesterday evening. We have 8 days before it becomes public record." 8 days. Imani absorbed this and the other direction. Kang-min's legal team reached out to my office at 6 this morning. They have a witness. A man named Daniel Cho, who is prepared to provide a sworn statement that he was approached by Madame Hiran 11 months ago and offered payment to establish a shell company and allow his identity to be used as the other end of a fabricated financial connection to your account. A pause. He also has text message records from the contact who facilitated the approach. A woman named Park Ji-won. Imani closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "He flipped," she said. "He provided the statement voluntarily in exchange for." Josephine paused, in the way she paused when she was choosing her words with particular care. "In exchange for certain protections related to the civil claims he had filed against the Seo organization, which have now been resolved. Kang-min made him a deal. Kang-min's organization resolved outstanding legal matters in a way that created sufficient motivation for Cho to cooperate." Another careful pause. "Yes, and Ji-won. Ji-won has already left the country. 3 days ago, the morning after she logged off the estate's network for the last time." A pause. She was given sufficient resources to leave. By Hiran. That would be the reasonable conclusion. Imani opened her eyes. The hotel room was pale with early light, the curtains translucent in the morning. The city already audible below in its routine way that was very indifferent to anything happening above it. So we have Cho's statement, she said, and the network intrusion data I found, and the footage, and the medical records. Yes. And they have a filing that contains fabricated documentation that we can now directly counter. Yes, but Josephine paused. But what? The filing also names Kang-min. Silence. It names him how, Imani said. It suggests that Kang-min was aware of your alleged financial activities and either participated in them or chose to conceal them in order to build a case against his mother that would justify removing her from the family structure. A pause. It frames the entire sequence of events, the footage, the confrontation in the dining room, the public removal of her privileges, as a coordinated effort by both of you to force her out. The shape of it settled over Imani like cold water. She's not just coming after me, Imani said. She's coming after both of you, Josephine said, simultaneously. And she is using the conflict between you against you, the fact that you have separated, that the marriage is in crisis, that you and Kang-min are currently on opposite sides of a legal process to make it appear that any coordination between you is itself evidence of the conspiracy she's alleging. If we work together to fight this, Imani said, it looks like we planned it. And if you fight it separately, Josephine said, you are weaker. The room was entirely quiet. She's been planning this for a year, Imani said, not with admiration, with the specific bitter recognition of someone who has just understood the full scope of the terrain they were standing on. She built a trap that closes whether I leave or stay, whether I fight with him or without him. Yes, Josephine said simply. And she filed 8 days from now because she calculated that 8 days was enough time to ensure the documentation felt credible and not enough time for you to mount a complete counter-response through standard legal channels. She knows how courts move. She has spent 35 years adjacent to significant legal activity, Josephine said. Yes, she knows how courts move. Imani stood up from the hotel desk. She walked to the window. She put her hand flat against the glass. Not dramatically, just needing the specific temperature of it, which was slightly cool in the morning, solid and real. I need a meeting, she said. Today, with you and Kang-min's legal team. All of us in the same room. A pause. You understand what that looks like, Josephine said carefully. If they're watching the coordination, I understand what it looks like. I need it anyway. Imani's voice was steady. She built this to separate us. She's using my separation from him as a structural element of her case. If I allow that to work, if I let her use the space between us as a weapon, then I am handing her the thing she built the whole apparatus to obtain. A breath. I am not going to let her use my choices as her materials. Another pause. Longer. I'll make the call, Josephine said. The meeting was at 1 in the afternoon in Josephine's conference room, which was a room without windows and with a table large enough for 8, and which smelled, as always, of recycled air and focus. Josephine sat at one end. Kang-min's lead attorney, a tall, precise man named David Rhee, who had been with the organization for 9 years and who Imani had met twice at formal events, and knew by reputation to be extremely effective and extremely expensive, sat at the other. 2 of Rhee's associates sat along one side with laptops and folders. Imani sat across from Rhee's associates. Kang-min sat at Imani's left. He had arrived 3 minutes before she did. When she walked in and he stood automatically, a reflex of some kind, and then seemed to realize he had done it and looked slightly uncertain about it, which was an expression she had almost never seen on his face. She had nodded at him once and taken her chair without ceremony, because there was no room in the next several hours for anything except the work. He sat. They were 2 feet apart. Neither of them addressed this. Rhee spoke first, laying out the counter case in the sequential, methodical way of a man who had organized a complex response quickly and needed everyone in the room to understand it at the same pace. Cho's statement, the text records from Ji-won, the network intrusion data from Imani's bank, the device identifier matching Ji-won's employment record, the continuous timestamp data from the estate's security system that proved the footage was unedited, the medical records, the witness accounts from estate staff. Taken individually, Rhee said, each of these is strong. Taken together, they don't just counter the filing. They expose it as fabricated, completely and documentably fabricated. Then we file the counter immediately, Josephine said. We file the counter today, Ree said, before her attorney has time to reinforce the narrative with any additional documentation. We preempt. He paused. But there's a component that requires a decision in this room. Everyone looked at him. The filing from Hairan's attorney, Ree said, contains one element that cannot be countered purely through legal documentation. He paused. The reputational element. The allegation, once filed, becomes a public record. Our counterfiling responds to the legal substance, but the allegation will have been stated publicly, and in the environment in which the Seo family operates. People will have read it before they read the counter. Kang-min said. Yes. So we get ahead of it, Kang-min said, before she files. Ree nodded slowly. That's the optional. Which means making a statement public, clear, and attributed about what happened at the estate and the nature of the allegation being prepared before it is filed. He paused. That is not a legal strategy. That is a different kind of strategy. The room looked at Kang-min. He looked at Imani. She felt his gaze on the side of her face and did not turn toward it immediately. She was looking at Ree's folder, at the edges of the documents visible inside it, and she was thinking about the specific mechanics of what was being proposed and what it cost more to not do. Then she turned. Kang-min was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the earliest years of their marriage, before the absences and the careful arrangements and the accumulated distance. The expression of a man who was asking a real question and did not have a prepared answer for any response she might give. If we do this, he said quietly, it means standing in the same direction, publicly. A pause. I understand, that's not, he stopped. Started again. I know you didn't sign up for another round of whatever this marriage looks like from the outside. I'm not asking you to. Another pause. The careful kind. I'm asking whether you're willing to stand next to me for the purpose of ending this particular thing on your own terms, for your own reasons. Imani looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the trap, about the year of preparation that had gone into it, about the specific intelligence of an adversary who had used Imani's own decision to leave as a structural component of the attack, who had calculated that Imani's autonomy, her refusal, her separation, could be reframed as conspiracy, and that the conflict inside the marriage could be used against both of them. She thought about what it meant to let someone else's strategy determine the shape of your response. She thought about her studio, the south-facing window, the jade plant, the life she had begun assembling with the same methodical care she applied to everything. She thought about what her grandmother would say, and her grandmother would say, "Baby, sometimes you don't fight to win what you lost. You fight to make sure they don't get to decide what comes next." I'm not doing this for the marriage, Imani said. I know, he said. I'm doing this because she built a year-long apparatus to take something from me, to take my name and attach it to something I didn't do, and use my own choices as evidence against me. A pause. I'm doing this because I am not going to let that stand. Okay, he said. And when it's done is when it's done, he said. I'm not asking for anything after. She held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then she looked at Ree. Draft the statement, she said. Both our names on it. Today. The statement went out at 4:47 in the afternoon, through 3 simultaneous channels, a formal press release through the Seo organization's communications office, a direct communication to 12 key figures in the city's legal and business community who were known to have had advance contact with Hairan's attorney, and a filing with the court system that pre-registered their counter documentation before the original claim could be formally lodged. It was 3 paragraphs, precise, direct, and signed by both Imani Rowe-Seo and Seo Kang-min. It described what had happened at the estate. It described the medical documentation. It described the fabricated financial allegation, and provided the specific counter-evidence, including the reference number for Cho's sworn statement. And it said in the final paragraph, in language that Imani had written herself, and that Ree had read and said only, this holds up, that the allegation being prepared against them had been assembled using a planted device, a paid intermediary, and a year of preparation by a party who had made a calculated decision that Imani Rowe-Seo's personal choices could be used as legal materials against her, and that this calculation had been wrong. By 6 in the evening, Hairan's attorney had called Ree's office twice. By 7, he had called a 3rd time. By 7:30, Josephine received a notification that the planned filing had been withdrawn from registration. She called Imani. It's pulled, she said. Imani was sitting on the floor of her studio. She had come here after the meeting, needing to be somewhere that was hers. The jade plant was on the windowsill. The evening light was doing the thing it did at this hour through this window, that specific quality she had imagined when she signed the lease. Pulled doesn't mean finished, she said. No, Josephine agreed. It means she's regrouping. She'll try something else, eventually. Probably. A pause. But what she had, the apparatus she built, that's gone. We have Cho's statement. We have the intrusion data. We have all of it on record. Whatever she builds next, she builds it knowing that. Imani looked at the jade plant. Are there any other devices on any network connected to anything of mine? She said. I have someone looking at that tonight. And the lease. I spoke to the landlord's attorney this afternoon. The connection to the Seo advisory fund was not something the landlord fully understood, I believe. He is, I think, genuinely not a person who wanted to be inside this particular conflict. He called me before I called him. A pause. The lease is secure. Imani exhaled. A slow, deliberate exhale, Josephine. Yes. What does she have left? A pause on the line. Thoughtful, not evasive. Her son's loyalty, Josephine said, which is what she has spent 35 years building, and today discovered looks different than she thought. Another pause, and her own sense of herself as a person who does not lose. That's dangerous, Imani said. It is, Josephine agreed. But it's a different kind of dangerous than what she had this morning. They ended the call. The studio was quiet. Outside, the city moved through its evening, in its particular indifferent way. A bus. Voices on the sidewalk below. The sound of the building's heating system starting up as the temperature dropped. Imani's phone lit up. A text from Kang-min, it said. It worked. Thank you. She looked at it for a moment. She typed, it worked for both of us. Sent it. Then she set the phone down and looked at the jade plant and thought about her grandmother's voice and about platforms and ground and the specific difference between standing on something and standing in something, and about the fact that the crisis she had walked into this morning had been survivable only because she had not stood in it alone. Not because she had forgiven anything, not because anything was repaired, but because sometimes the most autonomous thing you can do is choose your alliances with clear eyes, for reasons that are entirely your own, and refuse to let your enemies choose them for you. Her phone lit up again. Another text from Kang-min. It said she's not done. And then, after 2 seconds, a second message. It said, neither am I. Imani read both messages. She did not respond immediately. She set the phone down, and she stood up from the floor, and she went to the jade plant and touched one of its thick oval leaves, the specific tactile reality of a living thing that had grown and adapted and survived conditions it had not been designed for. And she thought about what came next, about what Hiran's next move would look like, and how much time they had before it arrived, and what it would require of her when it did. Because Josephine was right. Hiran was a woman who had built something for a year with patience and intelligence and cold, deliberate purpose, and she had watched it pulled from under her in a single afternoon. And a woman like that did not sit with that. She had one resource left, the relationship with her son that she had spent decades cultivating, and the absolute refusal to accept that a woman she had never considered a legitimate member of her family had walked out of that estate with the upper hand. And somewhere in the next hours or days or weeks, that resource was going to be deployed. The question was whether Imani would see it coming. She picked up her phone. She typed back to Kang-min, I know. Be ready. She hit send. The evening light through the south-facing window shifted as the sun moved lower, and the jade plant's leaves caught it and held it the way they always did. And the studio was quiet. And Imani stood in the middle of it, knowing that the thing they had stopped today was not the last thing, and the battle they had won this afternoon was not the final one, and that the real confrontation, the one that would settle everything permanently, that would determine once and for all what Hiran could and could not reach, was still coming. It was coming tonight, or tomorrow, or the day after. But it was coming, and this time, Imani intended to be the one who chose the ground it happened on. Hiran moved at 11:17 that night. Imani knew this because Kang-min texted her at 11:19. 2 words she called. And then, 40 seconds later, a third word, Min-che 2. She was still in the studio. She had not gone back to the hotel. She had been sitting on the floor with her back against the south wall, the jade plant on the windowsill, catching the ambient light of the city outside, her phone on her knee, and her mind doing the specific work of a person who has won a battle in the afternoon and is waiting for the shape of the next one to reveal itself. She had eaten half a sandwich from the place around the corner. She had drunk 2 cups of coffee and then switched to water because her hands had been slightly unsteady and she needed them steady. When the texts came, she read them and typed back, "What does she want?" The response took 4 minutes, which meant he was on the phone while he was texting, which meant whatever was happening was layered. Then she wants to meet. Tomorrow morning. She says it's about the estate. About items that were not included in your inventory. Imani read this twice. She typed, "What items, Kang-min?" She won't say on the phone. She says it has to be in person. Imani sat with this for a moment. Outside, a car passed. The city at 11:20 at night had a specific quality. Not quiet, but thinned. The daytime noise reduced to something more skeletal, the sounds that remain more distinct for having fewer sounds around them. She typed, "Where?" Kang-min, she suggested the estate. Imani almost laughed, not with humor, with the specific involuntary sound that comes from recognizing a move for exactly what it is. The estate, her territory, her ground. The place where she had the staff and the cameras and the structural authority of the walls themselves, which had absorbed 35 years of her particular brand of power and would perform it for her simply by standing. She typed, "No, Josephine's conference room, 10 in the morning. You, me, Josephine, Ree. She can bring whoever she wants." A pause. "Then she won't like that." Imani typed, "I know." She put the phone in her jacket pocket and stood up. Her legs were stiff from the floor, and her head still carried a faint ache at the back where the stitches were, a low, insistent reminder that she was a person with a body, and the body had been through something and was still accounting for it. She went to the jade plant. She checked the soil with one finger dry, enough that it could use water, not so dry that it was suffering. She got water from the studio's small utility sink and watered it slowly, watching the water darken the soil in a spreading circle from the base. Her grandmother had told her once that the secret to keeping a jade plant was restraint. You watered it when it needed water, not when you felt like it needed water. The distinction mattered because jade plants were succulents, and what they feared most was drowning in good intentions. Too much care killed them as surely as neglect, maybe faster. She set the watering cup down. She picked up her phone and called Josephine. It rang 4 times. "Then it's almost midnight, Imani." "She's requesting a meeting tomorrow morning," Imani said. 10 o'clock. "Your conference room." A pause. The sound of Josephine sitting up or switching on a light or both. "She agreed to your location?" "I haven't asked her yet." Kang-min is still on the phone with her. "But that's the offer." "What does she want?" "She says it's about items from the estate not covered in the inventory, which is either true and minor, or it's the pretext for whatever she's actually going to try." "It's the pretext," Josephine said without hesitation. "Yes." "What do you need from me tonight?" "Look at the inventory again. Every item I removed, every item documented, every item we have legal coverage on. If there's anything she can credibly claim was improperly included, anything with shared history, anything that was a gift from a Seo family member that she can argue remained family property. I need to know about it before 10. I'll have it by 8. Thank you." A pause. "Imani, are you sleeping tonight?" "Probably not." "Try," Josephine said. "You need your head clear tomorrow. She'll be looking for any seam in the presentation." Imani said she would try. She meant it, in the way you mean something you genuinely intend and genuinely doubt your capacity to execute. She ended the call. She looked at the studio, the empty space of it, the bare walls she hadn't hung anything on yet, the south-facing window with the jade plant and the city behind it, and she thought about what her life had been in space 8 months ago, when she had signed the lease and stood in the empty room and imagined what she was going to build in it. She had imagined clients and schedules and the particular satisfaction of organizing the other chaos into something manageable. She had imagined, in a private and unspoken way, a life that had room in it for her to breathe. She had not imagined this. But here she was in it, and the studio still smelled of paint and possibility, and the jade plant was watered. And tomorrow at 10 o'clock she was going to sit across from the woman who had put her on a marble floor and had spent a year building an apparatus to destroy her, and she was going to be ready. She turned off the studio lights. She went to the hotel. She slept 4 hours, which was not enough and was more than she expected. Hiran arrived at Josephine's building at 9:52. Imani knew because Josephine's assistant texted her from the lobby. She's here, alone. That was the first surprise. Imani had expected Minche at minimum, possibly an attorney, possibly both. Hiran had come alone. In the elevator. Into a building and a room on ground chosen by the woman she had spent 5 years systematically diminishing, and the past year preparing to legally destroy. Alone. Imani was already in the conference room when Hiran entered. Josephine sat to her left. Kang-min sat 2 chairs to her right, which was close enough to be present and far enough to make clear they were not a unit. Rhee sat beside Kang-min. The 2 associates with their laptops occupied the far end of the table. Hiran came through the door and stopped. She looked at the room, at the configuration of it, at Imani's position at the table, not the end, not the periphery, but squarely in the center, in the chair that faced the door, in the seat a person chooses when they are not concerned about who walks in. She looked at her son. He met her eyes and did not move. She pulled out the chair across from Imani and sat. It was immaculate. Hair done, a dark formal jacket. The particular composure of a woman who understood that appearance was the first argument and had made hers before she left the house. Her hands came to rest on the table, folded, controlled, familiar. She looked at Imani. "You look better," she said. Neutral, almost clinical. "I am better," Imani said. Same register. Josephine opened her folder. "Madam Hiran, you indicated a concern about estate inventory items. If you'd like to identify them specifically, we can address each one in turn." Hiran did not look at Josephine. "I'll get to that." She continued, looking at Imani. "I want to say something first." "You can say whatever you came to say," Imani said. A pause. Something moved behind Hiran's eyes. Not the calculation Imani had grown accustomed to reading there, but something less organized. Something that was working against its own management. "I have been doing this for 35 years, Hiran said. Managing this family, protecting what we built. Making decisions that nobody else wanted to make because they required a person willing to accept that being right sometimes looks wrong from the outside." A pause. "I did not always do it gently." "No," Imani said. "You didn't, but I did it. You did it for the family you decided was worth protecting," Imani said, "which did not include me." The room was very quiet. "You were not easy to include," Hiran said. Imani looked at her directly. "I was not difficult. I was different. Those are not the same thing. And you know that, and you chose to treat them as the same thing for 5 years because it served you." Hiran's jaw moved. "You don't understand what this family." "I understand exactly what this family is," Imani said. "I lived inside it for 5 years. I organized its estate, I attended its events, I learned its language and its customs and its particular way of performing itself to the world. I did all of that with more care and more effort than anyone in this room acknowledged. And the return on that investment was a slap and a shove and a marble floor." She paused. 1 beat. "And then a year of preparation to make sure that if I ever tried to leave, you had something to attach to my name that would follow me." Hiran did not look away. "The filing was a don't," Kang-min said. His mother stopped. He had said one word in the same quiet register he always used, and she stopped. And that stoppage, the automatic, immediate quality of it said something about 35 years of a particular power structure and what had happened to it in the past 4 days. He looked at his mother steadily. "We have Cho's statement. We have Jiwon's text records. We have the device data. We have all of it, and it is filed, and it is not going anywhere." A pause. "The filing you prepared is withdrawn, and what replaced it makes clear what the filing was. So whatever you came here to say about that." He paused again. "Don't." Hiran sat with this. For the first time in Imani's experience of her 5 years of dinners and events and controlled cruelties and the grand hall and the dining room and everything, Seo sat at a table and had nothing to reach for. No position, no coalition, no carefully constructed angle. Just the room, and the people in it, and the weight of what she had built and what had happened to it. "The items," Josephine said gently but firmly, bringing the room back to its stated purpose. "If you would identify them." Hiran reached into her bag and produced a single folded piece of paper. She set it on the table. She pushed it toward the center, but not all the way. She did not push it to Josephine's side. She left it in the space between herself and Imani. Imani picked it up. 4 items listed. A carved wooden side table that had belonged to Kang-min's paternal grandmother. A set of ceramic bowls purchased during the family's first year in this city before Imani. A framed calligraphy piece that had hung in the formal study for 20 years. And a jade pendant that Imani had received as a gift from Kang-min's aunt, the one who had stood up and left the dining room on Imani's first Lunar New Year with the family. Imani read the list. Then she set it down. She looked at the table for a moment. The side table she had not taken it, had never intended to take it. It was not on her inventory because it had never been hers. The bowls same. The calligraphy same. She had loved looking at it, had asked Kang-min about it once years ago, had been told its history. She had not taken it. The pendant. She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out a thin chain. At its end, a small oval of green jade in a simple setting. She looked at it. Then she looked at Hairan. The table, the bowls, the calligraphy. I don't have them, she said. They were never on my inventory. You can verify that with Josephine. She paused. The pendant was given to me by Auntie Young. On Lunar New Year 5 years ago, in front of 12 people. She put it around my neck herself. Hairan's eyes were on the pendant. That pendant was in the family before Auntie Young gave it to you. It was not hers to give. She thought it was, Imani said. She gave it to me. In front of your entire family. And not one person at that table objected. Not that night. You didn't belong at that table. The words came out with less armor than Hairan's words usually carried. Almost like she hadn't prepared them. Like they were the thing underneath everything else, the actual thing, finally audible without its management. The room sat with them. Kang-min said quietly, Mother. Hairan looked at her son. She belonged at that table, he said. She was my wife. She sat at that table because I asked her to marry me, and she said yes, and that means she belonged wherever my family sat. That has always been true. A pause. I failed to make it true. That's on me, but it was always true. Something crossed Hairan's face. It was not the controlled rearrangement Imani had seen in the grand hall. This was something older and less managed. The expression of a woman confronting a version of her son she had not prepared for. Because you cannot prepare for the version of someone that emerges when they have stopped allowing you to define the terms. I built this family, Hairan said. Her voice was low, almost to herself. I know, Kang-min said. Your father was gone before you were 15. I did this. I held this together. I made the decisions that kept us alive and respected. And I know, he said again, and I will always know that. But knowing what you built does not require me to excuse what you did with it. Hairan's hands on the table were no longer perfectly still. She will leave you, she said. It came out different from how it had sounded in previous rooms, not as a prediction made with contempt, but as a fear stated plainly. You know that. You see what she's doing. She has already left you once. She left because you made it impossible for her to stay, Kang-min said. Those are 2 different things. And after this, after the filing and the counter and all of, Hairan's voice broke very slightly, in the way a controlled voice breaks when the control has been deployed past its capacity. What happens after this, Kang-min? She goes back to her studio, and you go back to that empty house, and I am nowhere, and your sister is nowhere, and the family you have spent your entire life protecting. The family I protected, he said, put my wife on the floor. Silence. Complete and specific. Hairan closed her mouth. She looked at her son for a long moment with the specific expression of a woman who has run out of room, who has tried every available position and found that the positions no longer hold, who is standing in the wreckage of a strategy she built with patience and intelligence and genuine belief that she was protecting something worth protecting, and is discovering that the thing she protected so fiercely was not what she thought it was. She looked at Imani. Imani looked back. For 5 years, they had sat across from each other in various configurations, dinner tables, formal rooms, the specific social geography of events, where their relative positions were always legible to both of them. They had never sat across from each other like this, without armor on either side, without the particular performance that their roles in the household had required. I was wrong about you, Hairan said. The sentence arrived like something that had cost a great deal to produce. Imani held the words in the air for a moment, not with warmth, not with the quick absolution that such a sentence sometimes reaches for. She held them the way you hold something that has weight and deserves to be weighed. You were wrong about a lot of things, she said. About me, about what your son needed, about what protecting a family actually means. A pause. I don't know what to do with that yet. I don't know if there is anything to do with it, but I hear it. Hiran nodded once, the smallest movement. The specific economy of a woman who does not have access right now to any larger movement. Josephine said, the 3 items not on the inventory. We can draw up a confirmation document today that formally clarifies they remain estate property and were never removed. That resolves the legal question. A pause. The pendant is documented as a gift in the inventory and in witness accounts. It stays with Imani. Hiran did not object. The document was drawn up in 20 minutes, signed and filed. And then Hiran stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at her son one more time, a long look, the kind that carries a whole language of things that have not been and may never be said aloud. And then she looked at Imani. The studio, she said. I hear it's good work that you do there. Imani looked at her. It is. A pause. Then Hiran walked to the door, opened it, went through it with the same measured pace she had used in the grand hall, not fleeing, not shuffling, moving on her own terms to the door she chose. This time, she did not come back. The conference room had a particular quality in the minutes after she left, the kind of atmospheric shift that happens when a significant pressure is removed from a space. Not relief, exactly. More like the specific sensation of a room becoming its own size again. Rhee and his associates gathered their materials and made their courteous exit, leaving things to be formalized through the appropriate channels in the appropriate time. Josephine walked them out, and then returned briefly to tell Imani that the counterfiling was complete and the withdrawn filing from Hiran's attorney had been formally noted, and that, barring any new developments, the legal situation was as resolved as legal situations ever fully were. Then she left, too, and Imani and Kang-min were alone in the conference room for the first time. He was still sitting in his chair. He had not moved through the whole exchange, not through his mother's accusations, or her partial breaking, or her parting words, and he sat now in the aftermath of it with the stillness that was not controls, but something that had arrived on the other side of control. After you have held something difficult for long enough, that holding it no longer requires active effort. He looked tired, actually tired, not performing tiredness. There were things in his face that hadn't been visible to her before, or that she had stopped looking for. The specific weight of the past 4 days in the set of his eyes. Thank you, he said, for the statement, for showing up today. I told you why I did it, she said. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. She accepted this with a nod. What does Hiran do now, she asked. Not because she was afraid. Because she needed to know the complete shape of the terrain. She moves to the property in Busan, he said. I've made arrangements. She has resources. She has comfort. She has distance. A pause. She doesn't have access to anything connected to my operations or my household. That is permanent. And Min Che sent you a letter, he said. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, set on the table between them. She asked me to give it to you. I don't know what it says. Imani looked at the envelope. Her name on the front in Min Che's handwriting, which she recognized from years of place cards and notes, and the occasional passive-aggressive household memo. She did not open it now. She put it in her bag. The estate, she said. I'm selling it. She looked at him. It served a purpose, he said. That purpose is finished. I don't want to live in a building with that floor. He said it simply, not dramatically, just as a fact about a man and a floor and what the floor held. I found a place across the city. Smaller, no history. I'm not coming back to live with you, Imani said. I know, he said. I'm not asking. I need you to understand that clearly, she said. Not as a position I'm taking, as a fact. I built something across the city. The studio do the work. The life I started building. That is mine. And it doesn't include, she paused, chose her words. I'm not the person who comes back, because the crisis is over, and the bad situation has been resolved, and everything looks safer now. I understand. Do you, she said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you left because 5 years of who I was made it the only option you had. The crisis is not what drove you out. I drove you out by not looking at what was happening in my own house. A pause. Resolving the crisis doesn't undo the 5 years. I know that. Imani looked at him. The conference room around them was ordinary in its way table, chairs, the recycled air, the absent window, and they were two ordinary people sitting in it, which was something she had occasionally forgotten was possible, that they could be that. Two people in a room, without the weight of the estate or the organization or the family architecture pressing them into their respective shapes. "What do you want?" she asked. The actual question. The same one he had asked her in the dining room, which felt like a long time ago and was 4 days ago. He thought about it. Really thought about it. Not reaching for the answer that would sound right. "I want to know if there's a version of this that isn't over," he said. "Not now, not this year maybe, but eventually." A pause. "I want to know if that's possible. I'm not asking you to decide it now. I'm asking if it's possible." Imani sat with the question. She thought about the jade plant, about the south-facing window, about the studio that smelled like paint and the 4 hours of sleep she had gotten last night, and the sandwich she had eaten half of, and the financial records she had gone through 4 times, and the specific exhaustion of the past 5 days that had been built on top of the specific exhaustion of the past 5 years. She thought about the early years. Before the absences and the bracelets, and the distance that had accumulated in the particular way that distance accumulates between two people who are not paying attention, not in a single dramatic event, but in the 1,000 small moments of not quite, turning toward each other that add up, over years, into something that looks like separation even when you are living in the same house. She thought about him standing between her and his mother's raised hand. "I don't know," she said. "That's not a no. It's an actual I don't know." He nodded. "Okay," he said, and then after a moment, "That's enough." She stood. He stood. They moved toward the door in the natural way of two people who have reached the end of a room and need to leave it, and he held the door for her. Not with theater, just because they were both heading through it, and he got there first, and she went through it, and they stood for a moment in the corridor outside. "I'll be in touch through Rhea and Josephine," she said, "for the remaining settlement items." "Of course. And if anything else comes from Hiran, anything at all, you'll know first," he said, "before I respond to anything." She nodded. She walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button. Behind her, she heard him move in the other direction, his footsteps on the corridor floor, receding, not following her, going his own way. She listened to them until they rounded a corner and were gone. The elevator came. She stepped in. She rode down 14 floors in the specific silence of an elevator that is just an elevator, in a building that is just a building, on an afternoon that is just an afternoon. The lobby doors opened onto the street. She went straight to the studio. She had nowhere else she needed to be, and the studio was the place she needed to be when she had nowhere else she needed to be, which was its own information about what she had built and what it meant to her. She unlocked the door and went in, and stood in the center of the space, for a moment, just standing in it. The smell of it, the light coming through the south-facing window at 3 in the afternoon, the jade plant on the sill doing what it always did, which was exist with complete self-sufficiency in the conditions it had been given. She sat down at her desk. She had a client meeting tomorrow. A woman named Rosa, who was moving her mother out of a house she had lived in for 40 years, and who had called the studio last week, and cried on the phone for 6 minutes before getting to the part where she needed help. Imani had a folder for Rosa. She opened it and spent an hour going through the notes she'd made from their initial call, mapping the scope of the work, beginning to build the structure of how she would approach the job. This was the part she was good at taking something complicated and finding the architecture inside it, the organizing principle that made it navigable. She had been doing this for other people for 3 years. She had been doing it for herself for longer than that. At 4:30, she opened the letter from Min Che. It was 3 paragraphs, handwritten, which she hadn't expected. Min Che's handwriting was careful and slightly too upright, the handwriting of someone who had been corrected for messiness at some point and had overcorrected. The letter said that she was sorry, not in the elaborate constructed way of a prepared legal apology, but in the specific insufficient way of someone who knew that what they had done could not be adequately addressed by any arrangement of words, and was trying anyway. She wrote that she had borrowed money from Imani over the years, $12,000 across 7 instances, only 2 of which Imani had been told were loans rather than gifts, and that she was returning it, and the transfer confirmation was attached. She wrote that she had followed her mother because following her mother had been her entire structural understanding of how to exist in the family, and that she was beginning to understand that this had made her complicit in things she had told herself she was only witnessing. She wrote, "I don't expect anything from this letter. I'm sending it because it needed to be sent." Imani sat with the letter for a while. Then she put it in the folder she was keeping for things that needed to be held somewhere and did not yet need to be acted on. She looked at the transfer confirmation. $12,000. 7 instances, 2 of which she had known about. She had known those 2 were loans. She had not known about the other 5. She filed the confirmation in the same folder. The afternoon moved. The light changed the way it changed in this studio. The south-facing window was particular about its light, delivering it at specific angles as the day progressed. And Imani had been learning these angles over the months she had occupied the space. The jade plant at 3 caught the light on its upper leaves. By 4:30, it was the lower leaves. By 5, the light was oblique and golden, and the whole plant seemed to hold it differently, more completely, in a way that made it look like something lit inside. Her grandmother called at 5:15. "How are you, baby?" she said. No preamble. Just that. "I'm okay," Imani said. She paused, tried to find the accurate word for what she was. "I'm intact." "That's good," her grandmother said. "Intact is good." "How's the plant you kept when I took this one?" Imani asked. Her grandmother had taken a cutting from the original jade plant 2 years ago, when Imani had repotted it. "It's enormous," her grandmother said with satisfaction. "I had to put it on the porch." It was taking over the windowsill. "Same genetics," Imani said. "Same care," her grandmother said. "Genetics is just potential, baby. It's the care that decides what you get." They talked for 40 minutes. About nothing in particular, mostly. The neighborhood, a recipe her grandmother had been perfecting. A neighbor's new dog that was large and well-meaning, and destructive small garden borders. The kind of conversation that is not about its content, but about the sound of a familiar voice in a familiar register that tells you the world outside the crisis is still there, still going about its ordinary business, still available to you when you come back to it. After the call, Imani sat in the quiet studio for a while. She thought about Rosa and the 40-year house, and the work of tomorrow. She thought about the other clients she was building slowly, through careful reputation, one careful referral at a time. She thought about the name on the door, Row and Order. She had chosen that name before the marriage became what it became, and then the marriage had become what it became. And she had held on to the name anyway, and now she thought it was the right name for a different reason than she had originally intended. She thought about what Kang-min had asked in the conference room, if there was a version that wasn't over. Eventually, possibly, she didn't know. That was still the true answer. She did not know whether the thing that had existed between them in the early years, the specific quality of attention they had paid each other, the way they had fit together in the particular way of 2 people who are genuinely surprised by each other, whether any of that was still alive under the wreckage, or whether the wreckage was all that was there. She knew she was not going back to find out. Not now. Not this year. She knew that if something was there, it would survive the distance, because things that are genuinely there survive distance. And things that do not survive distance were perhaps not as there as they had appeared. She knew that she had her studio and her jade plant and a client named Rosa who was going to need someone patient and skilled and capable of finding the organizing principle inside an enormous amount of complicated loss. She knew that she had done something this week that she had not believed she was capable of. Not the fight, not the filing, not the statement. Smaller than that. She had looked at the full scope of what had been built against her, and she had not flinched into a smaller version of herself. She had not made herself manageable. She had not adjusted. She had been exactly who she was in every room she had been in this week, and that self had been enough. More than enough. She got up and went to the jade plant. She touched one of its thick oval leaves, the way she had touched it the night before. The specific tactile reality of a living thing that has survived and adapted, and does not require your approval to continue growing. Months later, the studio had clients and a waiting list, and a small additional office it had needed to expand into. And Rosa's mother's house had been cleared with care and documented, and its 40 years of accumulated life sorted into what stayed in the family, and what went forward and what was released. And on an evening in the following year, Kang-min came through the studio door carrying dinner. Not as a grand gesture, not with guards or drivers, or the organizational weight of who he was in the world outside that door, but as a man carrying food in paper bags who had called ahead and been told he could come. They ate at the desk, across from each other. Two people who had been through something large enough to have changed the shape of both of them, sitting in a room that belonged to one of them, with the jade plant on the windowsill, doing what it always did. He asked how Rosa was. She told him Rosa had started volunteering at a center for older women in transition, which was a thing that happened sometimes when you helped someone through a significant reorganization of their life. They turned around and started helping someone else do the same thing. He smiled, small but real. She noticed it. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed. The evening light through the south-facing window was doing the thing it did at this hour, that oblique golden quality, the particular way it found the jade plant and held it. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening. A bus, voices. The building's heat coming on. He said, "You know we can pay someone to—" "I know," she said. "Not about cleaning the window this time. Just, I know. About all of it. About what had been offered and what she had taken and what she had chosen not to take, and the territory between those things where they were still, carefully and without promises, finding their footing." She picked up her fork. He picked up his. The jade plant's leaves moved slightly in the air from the heating vent, the slow and living movement of something that had survived a hard season and come back not because it had been rescued, but because it had been tended, and because it had in itself the capacity to grow back from almost anything, if given enough light and enough time and enough of the particular restraint that knows the difference between caring for something and drowning it in good intentions. The old house was gone. The old marriage was gone. And in the space where those things had been, something smaller and less certain and considerably more honest was beginning, slowly, to take up room. That was not a happy ending. That was better than a happy ending. That was two people, imperfect and marked by what they had been through, sitting across from each other in the evening light and choosing, one ordinary moment at a time, to remain in the same room. That was enough. For now, it was exactly enough.